He danced into arenas draped in gold, floating on flying carpets, knocking out world champions with a single punch. Prince Naseem Hamed wasn't just a boxer. He was a phenomenon. Cocky, brilliant, and electrifying, he dominated the featherweight division with unmatched flair. By 26, he was undefeated, untouchable, and unstoppable. Then, just 2 years later, he vanished. No retirement fight, no goodbye, just silence. What happened? One brutal night in Las Vegas didn't just end his winning streak, it shattered something deeper. In the years that followed, the flamboyant champion ballooned in weight, served time in prison, and became a recluse. This isn't just a story about boxing. It's about ego, identity, and what happens when the spotlight fades. This is the rise and disappearance of Prince Naseem Hamed, a man who didn't just lose a fight, he lost himself. Before the lights, the flying carpets, and the $40,000 robes, there was just a scrawny kid from Sheffield, too small to scare anyone, too loud to ignore. Naseem Hamed was born on February 12, 1974, to Yemeni immigrant parents in the rough, working-class neighborhood of Wincobank. Life there was simple, often unforgiving. His father worked in a factory. Money was tight, but Naseem didn't grow up quiet or modest. Even as a child, his voice was big, his presence bigger, and his confidence unshakable. He told anyone who would listen, "I'm going to be a world champion, and I'll do it my way." That way wasn't conventional. It wasn't polished, and it wasn't always respected, but it was unmistakably his. It began in a small, gritty boxing gym above a shopping parade, Brendan Ingle's famous Wincobank gym. Ingle wasn't just a trainer. He was a philosopher in gloves, a father figure to misfits and misunderstood kids across Sheffield. And when he saw Naseem move for the first time, he didn't see arrogance. He saw potential, wild, raw, and unorthodox potential. Naseem didn't move like a typical boxer. He didn't jab, step back, and play it safe. He dipped, rolled, switched stances, and launched punches from angles that defied logic. He wasn't learning the rules, he was bending them. Ingle nurtured that chaos, giving him space to be unpredictable, but teaching him when to strike. It was in that tension, between freedom and discipline, that the legend of Prince Naseem was born. By his teenage years, Hamed had already earned a reputation in the amateur scene. He was fast, vicious, and flashy. While other young fighters trained to blend in, Naseem trained to stand out. Every punch he threw had drama. Every step he took felt choreographed, and underneath all of it was a burning belief that he was destined not just to fight, but to be seen. In 1992, at just 18 years old, Naseem Hamed turned professional. Most fighters enter the pro ranks quietly, cautiously. Naseem didn't. From the start, he was a showman. His walkouts were confident. His interviews were cocky. He didn't just predict knockouts, he promised them, and then delivered. What few understood at the time was that this wasn't just bluster, it was branding. Hamed wasn't trying to be liked, he was trying to be remembered, and he would be. But the world hadn't seen anything yet. The moment Naseem Hamed turned pro, the fuse was lit, but no one expected the explosion. Not like this. In the early 90s, British boxing was dominated by traditionalists, fighters who followed the blueprint: jab, guard, respect your opponent. Hamed tore that up. From his first televised bouts, he was impossible to ignore. He came in low, hands at his waist, chin exposed, a style that should have gotten him knocked out, but it didn't, because no one could hit him. His reflexes were freakish, his speed unreal, and his power unmatched for a featherweight. With each fight, the knockouts got more violent. These weren't technical stoppages. They were highlight reel detonations. Opponents didn't just lose, they got embarrassed. By 1994, Hamed had already claimed the European bantamweight title. A year later, he held the WBC international belt. His name was circulating, promoters started paying attention. Broadcasters didn't know what to make of him. Arrogant, Muslim, Yemeni, and flamboyant in a sport that was largely white, conservative, and rigid. But whether they liked him or not, they watched. Then came the night that changed everything. August 1995. Hamed traveled into hostile territory to face Steve Robinson for the WBO featherweight title in Robinson's home country of Wales. The crowd was brutal, jeering. Boos rained down as Hamed entered the arena, dancing to Arabic drums, arms outstretched, radiating defiance. He didn't care. From the opening bell, Hamed dismantled Robinson. It was a masterclass in chaos, dodging punches by millimeters, taunting mid-combination, landing landing shots from impossible angles. In round 8, it was over. A knockout. Clean, violent, and final. At just 21 years old, Naseem Hamed was now a world champion. The crown was his, and he wore it like royalty. Silk robes, diamond rings, gold chains. Hamed wasn't just a boxer anymore. He was becoming a brand, but it wasn't just show. His technique, however unorthodox, was effective. Analysts were baffled, fans were obsessed, and opponents were confused. He'd broken the sport's logic and replaced it with instinct. And from this moment forward, it wasn't about climbing, it was about dominating. With the WBO title strapped around his waist, Naseem Hamed stepped into a new phase, celebrity. But Hamed didn't just want to win titles, he wanted to become the name in boxing. And so, the persona grew. Every entrance was a spectacle. Sometimes it was Arabian drums, sometimes Michael Jackson. Once, it was a levitating platform. Another time, it was a flying carpet. Broadcasters didn't know whether to laugh or cheer. Critics were enraged. It's a circus act, they said. But fans were glued to the screen. Because Hamed was more than a fighter now. He was entertainment, and every fight felt like an event. He didn't just predict knockouts, he declared rounds. "I'll knock him out in the 4th, he'd say, and then do it. His bravado was magnetic. Even those who hated him couldn't look away. But underneath the bravado was a real fighter. That's what made it work. His hands were lightning, his timing surgical, his angles bizarre but effective, his hands low but his reflexes made up for it. He played with opponents, let them swing, miss, and then punished them with devastating counters. In the ring, he was loose, almost disrespectful in how little he guarded, but his opponents couldn't land. And when they did, it didn't seem to matter. Hamed had a chin, and even more dangerous, he had something to prove. In the years following his title win, Hamed remained undefeated. His KO ratio climbed. Opponent after opponent fell. And with every win, the myth grew. By the late 90s, he wasn't just a UK star. He was becoming a global one. American networks came calling. HBO offered a lucrative deal. The Prince was going international. And in 1997, at Madison Square Garden, he made his US debut against Kevin Kelly, a seasoned, dangerous fighter known for his power. What followed was one of the most chaotic, jaw-dropping fights in modern boxing. Hamed was knocked down twice, but he got back up. And in the 4th round, he ended it. A wild left hook. KO. The crowd went berserk. This British showman had come to the Mecca of boxing and delivered fireworks. American fans who once dismissed him now couldn't get enough. Sponsorships followed. Adidas, Pepsi, video games, TV cameos. Prince Naseem Hamed had done it. He wasn't just a champion, he was a superstar. By the turn of the millennium, Prince Naseem Hamed wasn't just the king of the featherweights, he was boxing's glittering enigma. Undefeated, untouched, unbothered. He held the WBO featherweight title for over 5 years, knocking out nearly every challenger in his path. But his influence reached far beyond the ring. He was now a global icon, appearing in Adidas commercials, video games, and even episodes of The Simpsons. He wasn't just winning fights, he was redefining what a boxer could be. Loud, flashy, flamboyant, unapologetically different. And for a British Yemeni Muslim, he was breaking barriers in a sport and society that often wanted him to play quiet. Inside the ring, he was chaos personified. There were no patterns to his movement, no predictability. One moment he'd be bouncing in a southpaw stance, the next he'd switch orthodox and throw a haymaker from below his waist. His defense was built on instinct, not structure. His offense on surprise, not strategy. And yet, it worked. Fight after fight ended in brutal, sometimes cartoonish knockouts. Opponents were left confused. Commentators were left speechless. Fans were left obsessed. But even as the myth of the Prince grew, something else started brewing beneath the surface. Discipline began to slide. Training sessions were missed. Sparring rounds skipped. Road work shortened. Trainers whispered that he was relying on talent instead of preparation, that his gifts were being wasted. Between fights, he ballooned in weight. Some said he would gain 30, even 40 pounds between bouts, then crash diet before fight week. He was walking a razor's edge, betting on his reflexes to bail him out. And for a while, they did. His relationship with Brendan Ingle, his longtime trainer and the man who helped mold him, deteriorated. Ingle warned that fame was changing Naseem, that the ego was taking over. Hamed disagreed. Eventually, Eventually, he left the man who made him. In a cold statement, he said, "I've outgrown him." The boxing world was stunned. In his place came Emanuel Steward, legendary trainer of Lennox Lewis and Thomas Hearns. Steward praised Hamed's raw ability, but he also saw the cracks. "He's got the power," Steward admitted, "but not the work ethic." Outside the ring, Hamed continued to live like royalty. Rolls Royces, watches worth more than cars, custom robes laced with diamonds. But the harder he flexed, the more people began to wonder, was he hiding something? By the late 1990s, Prince Naseem Hamed was still winning, but something was off. The opponents he was facing were different, less threatening, less accomplished. While the world clamored for matchups against the featherweight division's elite, fighters like Eric Morales, Juan Manuel Marquez, or even a young Floyd Mayweather, those fights never materialized. There were always reasons: negotiation issues, timing problems, purse splits. But to critics, the excuse didn't matter. The whispers grew louder. The prince is ducking the real killers. And inside the ring, those whispers had some weight. Though Hamed continued to win, his performances started to change. He still got the knockouts, but they took longer. His movement slowed. His reflexes, once supernatural, began to dull. More than anything, his style was regressing. He was relying almost entirely on power, neglecting the footwork, the rhythm, the unpredictability that once made him impossible to hit. The magic seemed to be fading, and worst of all, he didn't seem to notice or didn't care. He taunted fighters at press conferences, mocked their records, laughed in their faces. During fights, he'd drop his hands, stick out his tongue, lean into punches with no regard for defense. The arrogance that once felt charming now felt dangerous. Emanuel Steward, despite his praise, grew increasingly frustrated. He noted that Hamed wouldn't follow instructions, wouldn't spar properly, wouldn't focus in camp. He said bluntly, he thinks he's untouchable, but in boxing, nobody is. And yet, the prince still sold out arenas, still headlined pay-per-view, still strutted into the ring draped in silk and gold, as if gravity itself bent to his ego. But there was a problem no amount of charisma could mask. He wasn't evolving. The same tools he'd used to dominate in 1995 were no longer enough. Opponents were smarter, hungrier, more technical. And while Hamed stood still, the rest of the division was catching up. Boxing insiders started asking hard questions. Why won't he fight Morales? Why won't he unify titles? Why does every post-fight interview sound like a rerun? And for the first time, fans started to wonder the same. He was still the prince, still undefeated, still iconic. But for how much longer? April 7th, 2001, Las Vegas, MGM Grand. Everything Prince Naseem Hamed had built, every flip, every boast, every knockout, would be tested in a single night. His opponent? Marco Antonio Barrera, a Mexican technician with a granite chin, a relentless engine, and none of the flair Hamed thrived on. Barrera wasn't just tough, he was disciplined, and that made him dangerous. But Hamed didn't seem concerned. At the press conference, he promised an easy win. He'd knock Barrera out in under 6 rounds. "There's no way he lasts the distance with me," Hamed said, laughing. The same cockiness, the same confidence, the same prince. But from the opening bell, something was wrong. Barrera didn't bite on the feints, didn't get dazzled by the angles. He stood calm, composed, and quietly deconstructed Hamed's rhythm. He slipped jabs, countered clean, and turned Hamed constantly, never letting him plant his feet or showboat. Every time Naseem threw one of his leaping lefts, Barrera made him miss and made him pay. As the rounds piled up, it became clear to everyone watching. This wasn't a war. It wasn't a firefight. It was a clinical dismantling. In the corner, Emanuel Steward shouted instructions, but Hamed wasn't listening. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he didn't know how. Years of unchecked ego had made him uncoachable in the moment it mattered most. By round 10, the grin was gone, the swagger drained. Hamed was just trying to survive. Then, in round 12, the exclamation point. Barrera drove Hamed into a corner and, out of sheer domination, slammed his head into the turnbuckle. It cost him a point, but he didn't care. It was a message. I own this ring. The final scorecards were unanimous. No knockdowns, no flash, just 12 rounds of methodical destruction. And when the bell rang, it was clear. Prince Naseem Hamed hadn't just lost a fight. He'd lost his aura. No excuses, no controversy, no lucky punch, just pure, undeniable exposure. That night, millions saw the same thing. The showman had no plan B. And for the first time, the prince looked mortal. Most great fighters lose. Ali lost. Tyson lost. Even Mayweather, some argue, flirted with it. But what defines champions isn't the fall, it's what they do after. But for Prince Naseem Hamed, there was no after. In the wake of his humiliating loss to Marco Antonio Barrera, the boxing world waited. Surely there'd be a rematch, a training montage, a redemption arc. But nothing came. No press tour, no apology, no statement, just silence. Weeks passed, then months, and then, nearly a year later, April 2002, he returned. Not with vengeance, not to face Barrera again, but to fight a little-known Spaniard named Manuel Calvo. The event was barely promoted. In the US, it wasn't even televised, and when the bell rang, it was clear. Something was gone. Hamed looked sluggish, flat-footed, and disconnected. The old flair, the head movement, the swagger, the wild power, was nowhere to be found. He won by decision, but the crowd booed, not because he lost, but because they didn't recognize him. It wasn't the prince in the ring, it was a shadow. Commentators didn't mince words. He looked like a man trying to prove something to himself, and failing. After that fight, the silence returned. No next opponent, no comeback announcement. And then, reality sank in. He was done. At just 28 years old, Prince Naseem Hamed walked away from boxing. No farewell tour, no legacy fight, no proper goodbye. His camp said he was burnt out. Insiders whispered that the Barrera loss had shattered his psyche, that behind the flamboyance was a fragile ego that couldn't survive exposure. Brendan Ingle, his former trainer, put it bluntly. He thought he was untouchable, and when that illusion broke, he didn't know who he was anymore. Some said he refused to even re-watch the Barrera fight. Others claimed he still believed he'd won. But the truth was, it didn't matter. Because by refusing to confront that loss, Hamed robbed himself of the one thing all great fighters need: closure. And just like that, one of the most electric careers in boxing ended, not with a knockout, not with glory, but with a whisper. After disappearing from boxing, Prince Naseem Hamed didn't retreat into quiet dignity. He didn't reinvent himself as a trainer, commentator, or ambassador of the sport. Instead, he withdrew completely. And what followed was a transformation that shocked even his most loyal fans. Within just a few years, photos began to surface. A bloated figure, balding, unrecognizable, and visibly unhealthy. The once razor-sharp 126-pound phenom now looked double his fighting weight. The tabloids pounced. Memes exploded across social media. What happened to the prince? They mocked. But this wasn't just about looks. It was about a man who had let himself go, physically, emotionally, and publicly. Then came the darkest chapter. May 2005. Hamed was driving a $325,000 McLaren SLR on a narrow country road in Sheffield. Reports say he was driving recklessly, overtaking cars at over 90 miles per hour when he collided head-on with a Volkswagen Golf. The crash was horrific. The other driver, Anthony Bergen, suffered catastrophic injuries: a broken back, a shattered femur, crushed limbs, and over 20 surgeries. His life would never be the same. Hamed, meanwhile, fled the scene. When details emerged, public sentiment turned fast and hard. This wasn't the charismatic showman of the 90s. This was a man who seemed reckless, entitled, and dangerously out of touch. In 2006, he was sentenced to 15 months in prison for dangerous driving. The judge called it a dreadful piece of arrogant driving by an arrogant man. Hamed served just 4 months behind bars on an electronic tag, but the damage was done. His Member of the British Empire, MBE, awarded in 1999 for his contributions to sport, was stripped, a rare and humiliating rebuke. The man once celebrated for his flamboyance now found himself publicly shamed. He stopped giving interviews, stopped showing up at fight nights. His once vibrant public persona faded into tabloid scandal and silent isolation. And while his bank account remained solid thanks to wise property investments, the legacy he once dreamed of lay in ruin. Because for fans, it was no longer just about the boxing, it was about the fall and the silence that followed it. In 2015, a familiar face emerged on stage at the International Boxing Hall of Fame induction ceremony in Canastota, New York. But it wasn't the same prince. It was Naseem Hamed, visibly heavier, sweating, walking slowly, needing frequent breaks to sit. The crowd applauded, but the mood was complicated. Because how do you celebrate a man who set boxing on fire, only to walk away while the blaze was still raging? When Hamed took the mic, flashes of his charisma returned. "I didn't just box," he said. "I entertained. I made boxing sexy again." And he wasn't wrong. At his peak, Prince Naseem Hamed was unlike anything boxing had seen. His entrances were theater. His fights were chaos. His aura electric. electric. He inspired a generation of fighters. Some copied his footwork, others his flash, but none could replicate the feeling of watching him perform. And yet, his name is always followed by a question mark. What if he came back? What if he fought Morales? What if he didn't quit? He never took a commentary job, never trained the next generation, never really returned. He remained a figure from the past, showing up rarely, speaking briefly, and dodging questions about Barrera like a jab he no longer had the reflexes to slip. In one interview, when asked why he retired so early, he said, "I had nothing left to prove." But no one really believed that. Because the truth, unspoken but widely felt, is simpler. He never recovered. Not from the loss, not from the shame, not from watching the illusion of invincibility shatter in front of millions. Today, Hamed lives privately in Berkshire, in a multi-million-pound estate. His sons box recreationally, but none have turned pro. And perhaps that's intentional, because for all the money, all the fame, and all the knockouts, what Prince Naseem Hamed left behind was a cautionary tale. A reminder that talent alone isn't enough, that ego, unchecked, can be lethal, and that no matter how brightly you burn, if you don't evolve, you disappear. Some fighters are remembered for how they won, others for how they lost. But Prince Naseem Hamed, he's remembered for disappearing. He didn't burn out, he didn't fade away, he just left. At 28, he walked away from boxing. At 30, he vanished from the spotlight, and by the time he re-emerged, bloated, breathless, and broken, he was barely recognizable. Not just in appearance, in presence. The fighter who once danced into arenas on flying carpets now hid from cameras. The man who said, "I'm going to knock him spark out," could no longer look his own legacy in the eye. And that's the tragedy. Because Prince Naseem Hamed was brilliant, not just talented, electric. He changed boxing. He made it louder, funnier, flashier. He brought millions to the sport who had never watched a round in their life. But brilliance is a fragile thing. And without discipline, without humility, it becomes self-destructive. That's what happened to the prince. He built his entire identity on being invincible. So when reality cracked that illusion, when Barrera exposed not just his style, but his soul, there was nothing left underneath. No backup plan, no grit, no plan B. And in boxing, that's fatal. Most champions lose, but they grow, they adapt, they come back. Naseem never did, because maybe it was never about the fighting. Maybe it was always about the feeling, the lights, the cheers, the myth. And when that myth broke, the man behind it crumbled too. He once told a reporter, "I gave everything to boxing." And maybe that's true, but maybe the real tragedy is that when boxing stopped giving back, he had nothing left. No redemption arc, no reinvention, just silence. Today, fans still argue, was he a generational talent? Was he overhyped? Did he waste his potential? And maybe all of that's true, but the saddest truth of all is this. Prince Naseem Hamed didn't just lose a fight that night in Vegas. He lost the only version of himself he believed in, and once that was gone, there was no one left to save.